والصلاة والسلام على نبيه الكريم. Assalamu alaikum and very good evening to everyone. My name is Fathi Ahmed. I'm the research coordinator at the Research Center for Islamic Legislation and Ethics. First of all, I would like to extend my warm greetings and welcome to every one of you. I know that you could be somewhere else, at home with your family, watching TV, doing some shopping, but you prefer to be here tonight, and this is great. So we are honored with your attendance, and you are welcome, and thank you very much for coming and making it. I also would like to acknowledge the presence of our Dean, Professor Imaduddin Shaheen. Thank you very much also for coming and for attending our activity tonight. Tonight's panel discussion will address a very important issue because nowadays we are facing lots of challenges, moral problems, social problems, wars and conflicts, and many, many more. And therefore, the issue of ethics is in the center and in the heart of all these problems. We are honored to have with us tonight three distinguished speakers who will address the question of ethics in contemporary time, challenges and prospects. You can see the balance. We have challenges, we have also prospects. So before I introduce the first speaker, I would like to inform you that you have the translation device. So translation, instant interpreting is available from Arabic into English and vice versa. So the device is in front of you in your desk, so please feel free to use it, and you're welcome. I also would like to thank our interpreters. They are ready to start. Our first speaker will be Professor Dr. Tariq Ramadan. He is well known. I will not need much to introduce him, but it's my pleasure to introduce my boss. He is the director of the Research Center for Islamic Legislation and Ethics. He is also the professor of contemporary Islamic thought at Oxford University. He is an activist. He is well known. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala bless his efforts wherever he may go. So each speaker will speak for 20 minutes, and then we'll have a discussion. So Professor Tariq, please.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Thank you, Dr. Fathi, for this introduction, and thank you for being here this evening. And I really want to thank all the members of the Center for Islamic Legislation and Ethics for the work today and tomorrow. We have an internal seminar dealing with can you hear me? Is that okay? Yeah. An internal seminar on ethics and the challenges that we are facing in the light of the vision of the center, working also, of course, in the College of Islamic Studies, and we are very happy to have the Dean with us. Thank you so much for being with us this evening. In 20 minutes, the challenges and the prospects is something which is quite difficult. I'm just going to summarize some of the main points. We had already a discussion within the center this morning and with Professor Koons also, and I will refer to some of the things he said this morning, and I think that he might add to this in his presentation this evening. Let me start with 3 points, or 3 main points as an introduction to the discussion this evening when it comes to dealing with ethics. We have a problem of terminology. Terminology, not only when it comes to translation, we don't have a clear and a specific word in Arabic when it comes to define ethics. Akhlaq, it's not exactly ethics. And there is something which is a broad meaning, even from the Islamic and Arabic reference. because in al-akhlaq, it has to do with al-khalq, it has to do with the creation, it has to do with values, and it has to do with behavior. So the dimension which is very practical about the suluk, for example, is something which is not always there in philosophy or the theoretical approach that we have in philosophy. So there is something here which is quite specific, that we have a problem in the translation. And not only this, when it comes even, and we had a discussion this morning, that from a Western viewpoint, when it comes to ethics, we also have a problem. Is there a difference between ethics and morality? Are there differences when it comes to referring to morality that is produced by a religious reference or by a philosophy or by the reason? So the source is a problem. The very understanding of the values could be a problem. So we have a problem when it comes to the definition. Yet, if you look at all what is happening around the world in philosophical arenas, in religions or religious studies, ethics is everywhere. It's as if it's becoming a fashion. We always speak about ethics, and sometimes we prefer to speak about ethics than to speak about morality, as we prefer speaking about spirituality instead of speaking about religion. It's as if we are playing with words that are some words that are more fashionable than others. So we have to be quite clear on what do we mean when it comes to ethics, because for me, when I'm using ethics, I'm coming with something which is very deep, is touching the fundamentals of our religion and our philosophy. So I will come to this straight after my introduction. Having said this, it's something which is connected. If you come from a religious background, everything which has to do with ethics is connected to responsibility. And this is why when it comes to what is the source of ethics, it's also connected to which type of responsibility are going to get out of the whole system. Is it a responsibility, or is it first thought through the rights of the individuals? So this is a discussion that we had this morning, which is essential, is what is the source of ethics, and from where it comes, connected to the human responsibility. So straight away, you speak about ethics, you speak about a worldview and humanity within it. So how do you get the whole context? And I would say that we have to come to this discussion not to go straight to ethical concerns when it comes to scientific questions, but the great, the deep, the fundamental question that we have upstream. Now, the second thing which is also important, and this is the second point of my discussion here, my introduction, is when it comes to ethics and we speak about the values, we speak about what is bad and what is good, al-husn, al-hasan, al-qabih, all what the terminology that we have. We also have to ask ourselves in the practical sense is why are we talking about what is good and what is bad? In fact, is it only because we are trying to find the good behavior, or is there something in the way you deal with ethics, and it comes here to religion, to morality, which is the deep or the clear definition of what you are expecting from human beings? The Sufi tradition, the mystical tradition, is saying, in fact, what you are doing is you are trying to behave the right way to come close to God. The final goal is coming close to Him, meaning you start with Him, you end up with Him, and in between there is ethics. Ethics is the way you come close to Him by reforming yourself. So it's something which has to do with a personal responsibility with your own being and then with the world surrounding you. So ethics is not only about, defining what is good and what is bad. It has a personal impact, and it has to do with your personal responsibility. It has to do with a taklif, and the taklif is the very understanding of your relationship with God, which in fact comes back to the very meaning of Islam, which is the relationship with Tawheed. So no way you can understand the meaning of Tawheed if you don't understand the meaning of the ethical responsibility you have to reform yourself, to protect the creation, and to change it for the better, which are the three dimensions of what we are expecting from a human being. So straight away, I'm saying this, it appears to be quite obvious. It's not obvious when it comes to our discussion with Western philosophy, with secular philosophy, and with other religions. So here we are touching something which is essential. Now we can jump and say, you know what, at the end of the day we have common values. But that's not the point. The common values, if you don't start with the fundamental philosophy or philosophical or metaphysics, and I will come to this as a first point of my presentation, we might miss the great discussion which is needed. In fact, we need this discussion if the encounter between philosophies or between religions or between worldviews means something, it's there. It's exactly there. So ethics is revealing this discussion, and unfortunately, and it is one of our challenge, we miss the point and you come to secondary questions when it comes to our ethical challenges. So this is also one of the main challenge for me, is to start with the fundamental question at the beginning. So, and the last point is to understand two dimensions when it comes to ethics. There is a dimension of acknowledging and respecting. When it comes to ethics or morality here, when it comes to something which is religious, is respecting what? And respecting, how are you showing that you are respecting? Acknowledging that there is a creator and respecting him. And I mean by respecting him, something which is very deep in the spiritual understanding is out of love towards him, is to respect the creation as it is. Respect the creation means respect nature, respect the natural order, to respect even the meaning that you will find in the signs around you. سَنُرِيهِمْ آيَاتِنَا فِي الْآفَاقِ. The creation has a meaning. And when we say al-kitab al-manshur, that you have a word around us, there is a semantic in the world. There is a meaning in the world. The first dimension of ethics is respect the meaning of the creation. It has a meaning. The second, it's an active part of what you have to do, and this is why it's very practical. It has to do with the suluk, it has to do with the other dimension of al-akhlaq, which is not only you have to respect, but you have to reform for the better. So you have to have an active presence. Why? Because put as it is, based on your nature, you are going to corrupt the world. This is the very understanding of the presence. The angels asking us, asking Allah, asking God, أَتَجْعَلُ فِيهَا مَنْ يُفْسِدُ فِيهَا وَيَسْفِقُ الدِّمَاءِ. By definition, you let this human being, based on his nature, do what he can do, he's going to destroy. Ethics is about resisting your nature to come back to your spirituality to change the world for the better, and not to let your nature take over. So there is a double dimension here when it comes to this deep definition. And I would say that, as you can see here, I start with the deep understanding of ethics within an understanding of our relationship to God, the meaning of Tawheed, the meaning of creation, and the meaning of our presence on earth. That's something which is the starting point of our understanding when it comes to ethics, which when you speak with atheists, or when you speak with other philosophies, you might see straight away that we don't have the same understanding of what is the very function of ethics when it comes to the deep question. Having said that now, very quickly, some of the challenges that I see and the prospects for the future. The first one, as I was saying, is that we had a discussion this morning, and I wrote a book about an introduction to Islamic ethics. It's going to be the very short introduction to Islamic ethics at Oxford University Press. And in this book, what I'm trying to show when it comes to this introduction to Islamic ethics is, in fact, it was never a science, and I would say, from a religious perspective, walhamdulillah, that ethics has nothing to do with the science. Ethics is questioning, and it comes straight from metaphysics. It's even before a philosophy of life. Ethics has to do with the deep understanding of the creation, first God and the creation. So ethics is related to our relationship to the first principle, at Tawheed.
Tawheed to say, I acknowledge that there is only one God. Straight away, from an Islamic perspective, the ethical dimension is there. That you have to ask yourself, what is the right way, what is the wrong way? And it's the very essence of Sharia. No ethics, no Sharia. The way is based on this. So I would say here that the very essence of Tawheed means that it's a worldview. Out of this understanding, you will produce a philosophy of life, which is an Islamic philosophy of life. And this is where, between philosophies and between religions, we have to come to a discussion. But I would say we have to come to a discussion and an agreement without missing the first point, which is, what is your vision? What is your worldview? Why? Because this is going to have an impact on everything. If you don't speak about the worldview, you will be unable to speak about the very essence of sciences and the way you have to deal with knowledge. Because knowledge has to do with your worldview. Knowledge has to do with metaphysics. So Heidegger was saying about Nietzsche that he was the last metaphysician. And in this way, to come and to produce analytical philosophy, for example, dealing with the details, dealing with linguistic, dealing with an understanding of the truth and deconstructing the whole thing, could be a problem if, at the end, you end up talking about the consequences of deconstruction and not the principles of your worldview. And I would say coming back to ethics should be, from our perspective, something which has to do with an understanding of the creation. Now, so this is why I would say we have to talk about this in a very substantial way and even questioning our heritage. We don't have something which is you go to university and you have a department and this is the department where ethics is going to be taught as a science. Even in the masters that we have here, what we want is a transdisciplinary approach. And it has to be a transdisciplinary approach. Why? Getting an understanding of how it works with different sciences based on an understanding of the whole worldview that you may have. If we don't do this, if you don't connect ethics with all the sciences, and even within our heritage, is going to be a problem. And we also had a discussion with Dr. Nassar this morning and say, we are facing a crisis. What is the crisis when it comes to ethics? And my main problem is, if you look at the fuqaha now, the jurists, there is a problem in the way they are not always able to connect التشريع الإسلامي والأخلاق الإسلامية. This disconnect. That you have scholars now, in the name of the way they deal with fiqh, could make you accept in the legal field something that we know it's not ethical in our life. In the way, for example, we deal with nature, in the way, for example, we deal with economy. That we know that what we are doing is not ethical, but it could be legally accepted. We have in our traditional hayal, we know this, but it's deeper than that. It's that when the legal means could help you to avoid the ethical goals, you are in trouble. And you know what? We are in trouble in the Islamic universe of reference today. Because yes, we are facing, and even, it's going to be very deep, even in very specific situations, you can see that we have a tendency, it could be in bioethics, it could be in economy, that in the name of what we think it's acceptable, it could be useful for us to accept legally something that is problematic in ethical terms. So this disconnect between the legal and the ethical is problematic. It's even deeper than that. That we also have, in the way some literalists, from Salafiyya al-Harfiyya, for example, that in the name of the literal implementation of the rules could make us miss the goals of what we have to achieve. So we note, for example, that in many of our countries, our Muslim majority countries, some of what is perceived as Islamically acceptable is in fact, as to the society, promoting injustices in political terms or in economic terms. So when, for example, the literal acceptance with no ethics of some rules is making you missing the objective, the ethical objective, you are in trouble. And you know what? We are in trouble. Because this is happening in our Muslim majority countries, and it's happening even in many fields when it comes to cultural things, when it comes to consumerism. Consumerism. The way we deal in an ethical, you know what? Some are fasting legally and eating unethically during Ramadan. You get me? We are in trouble. So what is our daily experience it's also something which has to do with an intellectual problem here, which has to do with a crisis of knowledge, not only a crisis of influence or external influence. It's the way we are connecting or disconnecting the different fields when it comes to ethics, when it comes to law, and even the deep question. I know that some are not very, I'm always referring to the Sufi tradition. Always saying that there is Sufism and Sufism. There is a Sufism that is the heart of Islam, and there is a Sufism which is a new fashion. And I am not confusing Sufism with New Age. But in the deep tradition, from the very beginning, what we find in the questioning that we find in Hassan al-Basri, al-Muhasabi, or al-Junay, all this understanding, this deep understanding. Even we had a discussion this morning about Miskawayh saying he was completely influenced by the Greek. It's true, but with one exception. That he was not only dealing with as-sa'ada, which is coming, the happiness is coming from the Greek tradition, he was talking about al-mahabba, al-hubb, which is the dimension of God's love, which is coming deep from within the Islamic tradition. He was not reducing the whole thing into the Greek philosophy. So here we have something which is a question, and the Sufi are asking the question, at the end of the day, why are you trying to be ethical? What is the final goal of being ethical? Just to say that this is right and this is good? Are you technically abiding to ethics, or is there something which is deep here, which is the deep understanding of your relationship with God? Is it out of love that you are good, or out of a technicality? When I'm saying this, you can understand that with this spiritual input, you are questioning knowledge, and you are questioning the structure of knowledge. You are even questioning the use of science in what you are trying to do. At the end, what are you trying to do with knowledge? What are you trying to do with your scientific knowledge? So these are questions here that are coming to the essence of our understanding of the worldview that we have, the creation, and our legacy. I have a problem and I think that we have a problem from within with three things that are essential and revealed through the discussion about ethics. As I said, fragmentation of knowledge. We are looking at the West, and some of the scholars are saying the West is just showing that how fragmented knowledge is in the West, and there is no real ethics. First, to say that there is no ethics in the West is completely wrong. It's everywhere. It's everywhere. The question is not about this. The question is three things. The first is this fragmentation of knowledge, and we have it within our tradition as we see it in the West. Fragmentation of knowledge is, for example, two things that are present is that you see the fuqaha, or you see Ahl al-Tasawwuf, or you see the philosopher, if they are still philosophers that are accepted within the Islamic setting and discussion, completely fragmented, and this transdisciplinary approach is no longer there. The center of authority in Islam now is fiqh. This is where we are getting the rules, because it's the easiest way. our shuyukh are mainly fuqaha. And I have a problem when the legal, which is the means, becomes the center of authority where there is no philosophy of law and there is no understanding of the highest objectives of what we are trying to do. And the highest objective is not only coming from usul al-fiqh, it's or the fundamental of Islamic law and jurisprudence, it also has to do with the mystical approach, the spiritual approach is part of what should be our understanding of the objectives. Fragmentation of knowledge is something which is deep in our tradition now. Yes, okay. So this is one thing. The hierarchy that we have among knowledges also within our tradition, and this is also revealed, and the lack of link, as I said. Now, having said this, as the deep discussion which is needed now, and if I hope that we can provide Muslims today within the Muslim majority countries or in the West with something which is an added value coming from the center, is to never avoid these fundamental questions. The fundamental question, which is an inductive process coming from the ethical questions, the fundamental worldview that you are promoting. What are you trying to achieve? And in which way you are reconnecting all the knowledges together. So it's a way of reconciling the different fields in the name of the vision and trying to get a sense of what are the priorities. Now, what is the danger? I have been involved at the European level in the Committee of Ethics. And it's very interesting because we are sitting with scholars, some are atheists, agnostics, and some others are coming from different religious backgrounds. And we are talking about bioethics, we are talking about contemporary ethical issues. And what we see here is that we are not questioning the very nature of knowledge or the very goal of knowledge. We are saying, at this point, with this knowledge, we are able to do this. Is it ethical or not? And then we have to answer. So we have very interesting discussion about this is possible or this is not. Cloning, for example, bioethics on economy. Tell us from your tradition if this is good or bad. The point is that at the end, we are not discussing, we don't have a very deep discussion about ethics as our understanding of the world. It's a technical management, technical ethical management of what is possible when we are dealing with the situation the way it is. So there is a step, and this is why I was interested, and I hope that you will respond to me now, but when I was listening to you this morning, there is a kind of determinism that it's happening. So no way. We have just to deal. And Muslims today, very often, they are following in the footsteps. The only thing that we want to show that we are updated. We are able to respond as the others are responding. But I have a problem. Do we have to respond to halal or haram? Or do we have to question the very meaning of the question itself, the very meaning of the knowledge we have, the very meaning of this understanding? This is my point. My point is not tell me and show me that you are updated as to say this is halal and this is haram with cloning, but to question the very essence of this science itself, the ideology itself, the worldview itself. So it means for me that, and I can tell you that I see this with many fuqaha, many jurists, and even within our center we can have this attitude, which is in fact, at the end, the ethical discussion is to try to moralize the means, not to question the science and the goals. So you have a science, you have maybe an origin of this science, you have specific goals for this science. What you are expected to do is tell us if the means are moral or not, ethical or not. That's it. And you answer. And you are very happy as fuqaha to say, we are updated. We can answer this. I'm sorry. The world is in crisis not because of the lack of morality of the system, but because of the system itself. The problem that we have to question is the way it has. So for example, we speak about democracy. Some scholars are obsessed with the idea we have to show to the people that Islam is not against democracy. That's fine. I live in the West. I'm a citizen. Democracy today is in deep crisis because of the system itself, the way it works or it doesn't work today. When it comes to media, when it comes to structure of power, are we going to challenge this or just to show it's Islamically okay? So the way democracy is working now should be questioned at the roots of the worldview, not only to come with the critical, yes, we can. Get me? And being happy that he is the first African American to be elected. So I think here that there is a deep question in avoiding to follow in the footsteps of what is happening today in our world, the most industrialized society, and to end up having a technical, ethical management of reality. Last point for this. It's, in fact, the ethical questions, even in the West, is lost because of two things. The first is a highly specialized way of dealing with knowledge. It's very specialized, and it's fragmented. So, in fact, what we see, that all these committees of ethics are very bright and great, but they have no impact on reality. To the point that some scholars and scientists are saying, you know what, if we can do it, we are going to do it anyway. So you can carry on talking about ethics, but this is where we are showing our humanity, but it's going to happen. And at the end, the ethical reference is just a philosophical discussion on something that could happen, that could not happen, but at the end, the world is still moving. So the question that Professor was asking us this morning is, how are you going to reach out the people, have an impact on the world? And this is the best question. This is the essential question. How are you going to have an impact? So if you only try to deal with the reality as it is and try to come with technical answer to deep question, at the end we are not going to have an impact on the world. And we are not showing that Islam with other philosophies, not only Islam, but with Christianity, with Judaism, with Buddhism, with atheism in the philosophical heritage and legacy, could propose something which is different as to our understanding of this worldview, sciences, knowledge, and what we want to take to bring out of this. So here, I think that the fact that the people are telling us there are no more ideologies, and it's all fragmented and very specialized, we lost the semantic of the world. And there is a grammar that is lost here in the way we deal with the creation. So are we able to come back to this? That you understand that even with the text, the world is a text. يُحَرِّفُونَ الْكَلِمَ عَنْ مَوَاضِعِهِ. So what people did with the scriptural sources, we are doing it with the creation. We are changing the very meaning of things by being very specialized and not having a vision and the an ethical proposal here based on upstream a vision or a worldview and then an understanding of the three things that I think are important. And we have this in our tradition. The deep discussion about the source of the ethical values, the means of the ethical values, and the goals. I don't see any way from the Muslim viewpoint for us to propose and to have an added value in the discussion if we do not reconcile akhlaq, ahkam, or maqasid. The three dimensions. And not al-ahkam at the price of the maqasid or the maqasid at the price. Because what I see now, it's a fashion. All the people are talking about the maqasid. It's a way to avoid al-ahkam, the rules. And some say, we know that you are using the maqasid, which are the objectives, to avoid the ahkam. So we have to come to the ahkam. We have the literalist. And in between, as I said, ethics is lost, which is the very meaning of what we are doing. So this reconciliation is one of the big challenges. The second thing is it should come from within. From within, it's essential. And from within doesn't mean exclusively from within, but having an intrinsic discussion, an internal discussion, and at the same time be able to come to the discussion with all our other fellow citizens. And once again, we had a discussion this morning, and as a center, we invited some, Professor Koons came with the secular Western approach. This is essential because we need this discussion. We need this discussion for two reasons. First, to understand the rationale and the history, but also to know what are the limits of what we agree upon. Somebody who's telling me, you know what? My ethics has, as a center, individual. The individual. I say, I'm sorry, I cannot follow this. The center is not for me the individual. For me, it's God. Because at the end, I'm ethical because I want to be loved by Him. I want to love Him. My ethics, I'm trying to be a good person because I love Him and I want to be loved by Him. I don't want to be free. I'm very close to the Kabbalistic understanding that my freedom is when my will is mirroring His will. That's my ethics. That's completely opposite to what is coming from a Western viewpoint, a secular Western viewpoint, because there are many things on which we can agree. What I'm saying is that this deep discussion is necessary to know and not to come to a simple, good statement, we agree on the essential. I'm sorry. In fact, we can agree on the secondary issues because we don't agree on the essential. We don't. So let us start with talking about a respectful disagreement on the essential to come to an effective agreement on the secondary issues. Wallahu a'lam wa a'la wa ahkam. Thank you.
Can you just clarify? Deducted from the discussion. Thank you, Dr. Tariq, for your in-depth presentation. I would take a few points just quickly. I'm not going to summarize, but just to highlight a few points. Ethics is not a science. Ethics is to come close to God out of love. Never avoid, discussing or addressing fundamental issues and the problem of fragmentation of knowledge. With this, I will leave you with Dr. Tariq's thoughts. Now, I would like to just a kind request from our audience that please avoid pushing the button in front of you because it's causing some echoes, as you can hear just now. So please try to avoid that. Our next speaker is Dr. Jeremy Kunz. Jeremy Kunz is an associate professor of philosophy at the Georgetown University School of Foreign Service in Qatar. Dr. Koons' research has focused on questions of how to fit moral and other kinds of values and norms into a naturalistic worldview, the structure of a human knowledge, and the philosophy of religion, such as the problem of evil, our knowledge of God, and the relation between God and morality. Dr. Koons' first book, Pragmatic Reasons, A Defense of Morality and Epistemology, and it was published in 2009. The normative and the natural, it was co-authored with Dr. Michael Wolff, and it was published in 2016. And his third book, The Ethics of Wilfrid Sellars, yes, is under contract with Routledge Studies in American Philosophy. Dr. Koons has previously taught at the American University of Beirut and Hong Kong University and Stonehill College in the States. So Dr. Koons, please, you have 20 minutes. Thank you. Thank you, welcome.
Thank you for your invitation this evening. It's an honor to be invited by Dr. Ramadan to speak at CILE, the Research Center for Islamic Ethics and Legislation, here at the College of Islamic Studies at Hamad bin Khalifa University. Dr. Ramadan is a tough act to follow, so under the philosophy that if you can't beat them, do something completely different, I'm going to give a somewhat less academic talk. I've been invited to talk about the challenges and prospects for ethics in contemporary time. I want to begin by talking about two challenges to an ethical world that we face in our time, really in any time. But I also want to argue that that the news is not all bad. There are at least two reasons to be hopeful for the prospects for a more ethical world in contemporary time. But let me start by talking about the challenges. A hero died in December, not a comic book hero, although that's the kind we're most familiar with, not a hero from a movie, but a real-life hero. His name was Lawrence Colburn, and he was the last surviving member of the helicopter crew that stopped the Malai Massacre in Vietnam in 1968. Now, many of you might not be familiar with the Malai Massacre. The details are quite simple. On March 16, 1968, U.S. troops under the command of Ernest Medina entered two villages in South Vietnam looking for enemy troops. They didn't find any, so they started killing civilians, killing as many as 500. As terrible as this incident was, it would have been much worse were it not for the brave actions of three men. Hugh Thompson was a helicopter pilot assigned to provide aerial reconnaissance for the troops on the ground. He landed his helicopter between U.S. troops and a group of unarmed civilians, and he ordered his two gunners, Lawrence Colburn and Glenn Andreotta, to point their guns at U.S. troops and fire on them if they interfered with his attempt to rescue the civilians. Thompson rescued the civilians and reported the massacre to headquarters, which issued the order to stop the killing of civilians. Only one person, William Calley, was ever put in jail for his role at the Malai Massacre, and President Nixon pardoned him after he'd served only 3 years in jail. Colburn and Thompson testified at his trial. Andreotta did not survive long enough to do so. For their heroism, they were rewarded with hate mail and death threats for being traitors to their country, such as the lot of the hero. Heroism like theirs is to be celebrated, but of course heroism is only made possible by great and terrible evil. And the sources of this evil are very predictable, sources that remain the same over time. These sources are ever present, and they're ever dangerous challenges to ethics in our time and in any time. One danger of ethics is illustrated by the Malai Massacre. The danger is the evil that humans willingly do simply out of obedience to authority. The Nuremberg trials after World War II established a clear legal principle. A soldier is not permitted to follow an illegal order, and just following orders is no defense against a charge of war crimes. However, as Lawrence Lacroix, one of the participants in the Malai Massacre, later said, a lot of people talk about Malai and they say, well, but you can't follow an illegal order. Trust me, there is no such thing, not in the military. If I go into a combat situation and I tell them, no, I'm not going to follow that order, they'd put me up against a wall and shoot me. Following authority is one of the most natural things for humans to do, and it's one of the most difficult things to resist. Now, this fact was dramatically demonstrated in 1961 by Stanley Milgram, someone many of you have probably heard of, in a very famous set of experiments that he later described in his book, Obedience to Authority. Now, in this experiment, and again, many of you might already be familiar with this experiment, test subjects were told that they were going to be the teacher in an experiment, and they would deliver a series of electric shocks to a learner whenever the learner answered a question wrong. Now, the teacher first experienced a small but painful electric shock so that he or she would know what the learners were experiencing. The teacher was then instructed to turn the dial to make the electrical shock stronger, each shock stronger than the last, in 15-volt increments. Now, the learner in question was an actor and never actually received any shock, was never harmed or injured in any way, but the teacher didn't know this. The teacher thought that he or she was actually delivering incrementally larger electrical shocks to a learner. Now, the teacher also could not see the learner. The learner was behind a screen, but the teacher could hear the learner. And every time the teacher would deliver a shock to the learner would shout, would scream, would beg for the experiment to stop, would complain about a heart condition, and would eventually fall silent. Now, the teachers would often ask to stop the study. They would ask if the study was necessary. but a scientist standing next to them would assure them that it was necessary for the experiment to continue. Now, Milgram thought, going into the study, that only a very small percentage of the population, those exhibiting clear symptoms of psychopathy, maybe 2%, would go through with the experiment all the way to the end. To his extreme dismay, 2/3 of all subjects went all the way to the end, all the way to the highest voltage of electricity, 450 volts, continuing even after the learner had fallen silent and quit responding. Milgram concluded from this that people will even kill test subjects as long as they are being told to do so by someone who appears to be in a position of authority, meaning someone who's wearing a lab coat and holding a clipboard. Authority. That's all it takes for someone to become a murderer. Henry David Thoreau, who wrote a very withering critique of mere obedience to authority, said that when you obey authority rather than your conscience, you are as likely to serve the devil without intending it as God. And do we not see daily people who, out of obedience to authority, are acting in service of evil merely because they're being told to do so? Authority, of course, comes in many forms. Government authority is only the most obvious, but it's not the most common and it's not the most pervasive. There is the authority of society over the individual, for example. It's nearly impossible to resist, and it's everywhere, and it can keep people from doing the right thing, or from helping those who need helping, or reaching out to people who are despised and hated by society. Maybe you want to speak up on an important issue, but you don't for fear of what your friends will say. Maybe you want to associate with someone, but you don't because of what your family will say. 150 years ago, John Stuart Mill wrote the following about English society. In our times, from the highest class of society down to the lowest, everyone lives as under the eye of a hostile and dreaded censorship. The mind is bowed to the yoke, even in what people do for pleasure. Conformity is the first thing thought of. Now, of course, Mill is writing about English society of 150 years ago, but what he says seems true of every society in every age. Now, obviously, authority is not always a bad thing. Parental authority is a good thing, I say as a parent. The authority of society is at least sometimes a good thing. I will return to this point shortly, I promise. Really. Now, Upton Sinclair used to say, "It is difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on his not understanding it." More generally, it's very difficult for people to do the right thing when this means acting directly against their self-interest. Examples are, sadly, not at all difficult to find, and these examples can often have terrible, terrible consequences. Here is one example that has terrible, terrible consequences. So in 2002 and 2003, the Pentagon hired a number of analysts to go on television and make the case for the invasion of Iraq. Many of these analysts actually worked for defense contractors. So therefore, they had a vested interest in doing what the Pentagon told them to do for fear of losing lucrative contracts. So here is an example of someone putting self-interest ahead of the greater good, ahead of what's morally right. Timur Eads, who worked for a military contractor, said that he hesitated to criticize the war on television for fear that, quote, some four-star general would call up and say, "Kill that contract." Or consider it Robert Bevilacqua. Again, we have an example of someone who put self-interest ahead of what was morally right. He and another analyst had formed a company called the WVC3 Group and were hoping to win profitable government contracts. He was invited to a Pentagon briefing in early 2003, before the invasion, a briefing on Iraq's supposed weapons of mass destruction. He and the other analysts were alarmed at how weak the evidence was that the Pentagon was presenting them with. He says, "We were looking at ourselves saying, 'What are we doing?' He said. But of course, none of these analysts actually expressed any of these doubts when they went on television and talked to the public. Why did they not express any of these doubts publicly? I think the answer is relatively clear, right? And of course, the same pattern is repeating itself again. If you turn on a US political talk show, you might see this guy, General Jack Keane, retired. he will be arguing that the US needs to drop more bombs, deploy more troops, in general, spend more money. Of course, the viewers watching him might well trust and believe him. I mean, he's a retired general. He knows what he's talking about, right? One of the things that he might not mention, of course, is that he's on the board of General Dynamics, which is a major defense contractor, and that they paid him over $250,000 in 2013 alone. Sadly, it is all too easy for humans to put self-interest, wealth, ahead of morality and ethics. Now, of course, most examples aren't nearly as dramatic as this. A student might cheat on an exam, hoping to do better in a course. A person might choose never to give to charity, instead spending their money on unnecessary luxuries. These are more common. The challenge, of course, is not just to raise children and adults with integrity. The challenge is to create an environment where moral corruption is not accepted, where we don't simply shrug our shoulders and treat it as inevitable, but because it is inevitable as long as we treat it as such. Now, that's the bad news. What's the good news? Now, I've discussed I promise there is good news, right? It's not all bad news. I've discussed two major challenges to ethics. Let's turn to two sources of ethical improvement. The first deals with the benefits of authority, which I promised I would come back to. Now, when talking about the challenges to ethics in contemporary time, I talked about the brutal crimes against humanity that people do merely out of obedience to authority. But I said, authority is not always a bad thing. As I said, parental authority is a good thing. The authority of society is often a good thing. It is an ever-present source of danger. It's too difficult to resist. People who have authority will usually try to extend their authority, and they won't always use it for good. But there's reason to think that some kinds of authority have been a force for moral good in contemporary times. Let me explain. So recently, Steven Pinker published a book, The Better Angels of Our Nature. In this book, he argued that despite appearances, and this is a very counterintuitive thesis, despite appearances, the world is getting less violent. Like I said, this is a very counterintuitive thesis. For example, and he gives a number of examples. His book is very data-driven. He says, for example, Pinker says the murder rate in medieval Europe was 30 times what it is today. Granted, the 20th century had its share of brutal wars, but for example, consider that during the 30 Years' War, from 1618 to 1648 in Germany, fully 1/3 of the German population was killed. 1/3. And maybe 1/5 of the Holy Roman Empire. At the same time, in China, during 1618, the Qing dynasty conquest of the Ming dynasty resulted in the death of at least 1 in 6 Chinese, quite possibly more. Now, let's not be foolish. I don't need to tell anyone that there is terrible war and violence in the world today. We've seen the disintegration of a number of states in the last decade, and this has led to the kind of insecurity that Pinker has argued is on the decrease in the past centuries. But what Pinker wants to emphasize is that there are 7 billion people in the world today, and most of them live in relative security. A person born today is much less likely to die a violent death than a person born at any other time in the history of the world. Why? Asks Pinker. The answer comes down to authority, specifically the authority of the state. 500 years ago, or 1,000 years ago, states were much weaker, much less powerful, and they couldn't protect their citizens from outlaws and militias very effectively. Nowadays, weak states, or failed states, are the shocking and heartbreaking exception to the rule, but they're not the rule. So most people don't have to worry so much about roving bands of militias or outlaws or criminals who can operate without fear of government authority. States generally have much more control over what happens within their borders, and so they're much more able, usually, to guarantee the safety of their citizens. Now, along with this, there's been what Pinker calls the humanitarian revolution. Practices that used to be common, like torturing suspected criminals to extract confessions, they certainly still exist, to be sure, but they're practiced much more rarely than before, and they're not widely accepted as being morally okay. Also, because of the rights revolution, as he calls it, there is an increasing recognition of the dignity and the worth of individuals, including minorities, and a corresponding move to treat people with greater dignity and respect. Ideas like this are embodied in the UN Declaration on Human Rights, authored by leading intellectuals like Charles Malik of Lebanon and P.C. Chang from China. Now, of course, all of this is aspirational. Nobody thinks that these ideas are actually universally respected around the world. Pinker's point is not that we've achieved some kind of fabulous utopia, because that would be a foolish thing to argue. He's arguing for incremental improvement, not for the fact that we've reached some kind of great utopia. So his point is that, that authority can actually be a force for improvement in the ethical lives of people, and not merely a source of danger, though it is a source of danger. Now, more good news, we hope. There's a second source of moral improvement in the state of the world, and this deals with the spread of wealth and opportunity. In general, and again, we're speaking in broad generalizations, the plight of humanity has improved over the last centuries. Again, let's not be naive. There's still terrible poverty and deprivation in the world, and many people are denied any real chance to improve their lot in life. But there have been significant improvements, most significantly in the last 200 years, roughly since the start of the Industrial Revolution. So, for example, in 1820, 75% of the world's population lived on less than $1 per day, adjusted for inflation. Now, only around 15% of the world's population does. So again, 15% is not good news, but it's a significant, dramatic improvement over what things were like only 200 years ago. The improvements in the last half of the 20th century have been especially dramatic. So, for example, literacy rates across the world went from 54% in 1950 to 79% by the turn of the century. Infant mortality rates dramatically decreased from 156 live births, 156 deaths per live birth in 1950 to roughly one-third that by the turn of the century. And also, most of these improvements were seen in the developing world. So again, one would have to be blind, I think, not to see the tremendous moral challenges and tragedies that unfold around us on a daily basis. But we should also not be blind to the slow but very real progress that we're making toward a more humane world. Now, let me wrap up here. I was invited to attend this event largely, I believe, to represent a particular point of view. I was explicitly invited to the internal seminar for that, and I'm just going to assume that's why I was invited to this as well. I'm going with it. I think I was invited to present the secular point of view. I think this is a point of view that is often discounted or mistrusted by religious moralists. Now, being honest, it doesn't help that many of the most prominent promoters of secularism and atheism, like Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins, often come across as deeply, deeply unlikable. But religious thinkers, I think, often see secular thinkers as a threat to the moral order and as undermining something of fundamental importance, something that we as humans cannot do without. But I think by the same token, there is a tendency on the part of secular moralists to distrust the religious point of view. Many secular thinkers that religion is inherently oppressive or inherently conservative and is something that has to be fought at every single turn. Let me give you an example. Last year, I participated in an event over at Georgetown on the topic of whether religion is necessary for morality. A Jesuit priest was there, and he related the following story. He used to participate in, volunteer with a human rights organization in Washington, D.C. This human rights organization campaigned against the death penalty. They fought for human rights around the world. But the members of this rights organization were overwhelmingly non-religious. And when he started attending meetings of this organization, they regarded him with deep, deep suspicion. He and his kind were part of the problem, they thought. And he had to win their trust. So again, I think many people who are approaching ethics from the secular standpoint regard religious people as also not entirely to be trusted. So the mistrust goes both ways, right? But I think I'm in agreement with Peter Smith, and this might put me somewhat at odds with Professor Ramadan, and this is something we can talk about during the discussion, as I would like to respond to some of what you said there. I'm in agreement with Peter Smith when he says, the so-called war between secularism and religion is now becoming counterproductive. attention should be shifted to the real enemy, moral suffering. To overcome this enemy, the secular world should make common cause with the religious world, which I take it should be possible at least on secondary questions, if possibly not on what you consider to be the essential questions. Now, I've argued that there are significant improvements in the moral state of the world, but again, I take it it's obvious to everyone that significant challenges remain. Events like the one we're having tonight should remind us that regardless of the source of our values, we do share many values in common, and I think that this gives us common ground to face these major challenges together. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Koons, for this wonderful and systematic presentation. I like it. There are many things to remember, but I would like to share with you that he was very systematic in terms of providing two challenges and two prospects, and that's the balance, and with the summary. The things that I like also is the illustration and the case studies. That's wonderful. And now, without further ado, I would like to introduce Dr. Jamal Nassar, our third speaker. دكتور جمال النصار حاصل على الماجستير.
Got his master's degree in 1996 and PhD in 2002 in Islamic philosophy from the University of Cairo. He has so many publications, among them The Prestige of Ethics in the Islamic Intellect, and this is published in 2003, and Islamic Ethics and Their Role in Building Society, and this was published in 2010, and Views of Politics in 2010, and he has taken part in many conferences, scientific, local, international, with research presentations, among them the godly natural ways of bringing about aid and victory, and also the reconnaissance of the nation and the influence of globalization in contemporary intellect. And he is now working with the Center for Civilizations for Future Studies in Cairo. Dr. Nassar, you have the floor. You have 20 minutes. Thank you very much. In the name of Allah, the Gracious, the Merciful, I would like to thank the Research Center for Islamic Legislation and Ethics, specifically Dr. Tariq Ramadan, for his invitation, and I greet you all with the greeting of Islam, and that is the greeting of peace. So may the peace of Allah be upon you all. I may build on what Dr. Ramadan has said, so I think he has spoken about fundamental issues of ethics, as long as he does not want to speak about the science of ethics. And maybe I differ with him from that viewpoint, and I'll try to answer 5 questions. The first one, do we need ethics? Second, the absence of ethics, would it lead to backwardness and deterioration or collapse? The third one is, ethics, do they have a significance and impact in the Islamic heritage and culture? And what are the main causes of the ethical crisis that we live? Are there means to formulate and acquire ethics? To answer the first question, I would say, unfortunately, we are living in a state of confusion. If you look at the reality that we live, you will find that ethics do not have space in life. And I wish, in fact, that it would become a fashion, just like Dr. Ramadan said. And I hope it will be a common fashion that we uphold ethics, but unfortunately we lost that fashion and we are adopting other fashions. And some imagined that ethics and upholding them would lead us to backwardness and lagging behind in so many fields. And without knowing, we have substituted Islamic ethics with expediency of ethics or Machiavellian ethics, which justify the means in order to reach the goal. In fact, a saying has become prevalent which says that in the Muslim countries there is Islam without Muslims. The first one who said it, as you all know, is Sheikh Muhammad Abdo. And in the West there are Muslims but without Islam. And that is to show that Muslims are not upholding their Islamic ethics at the time when the Westerners are upholding and following Islamic law ethics without being Muslims. So our staying away from ethics and abandoning our Islamic ethics has led to a deterioration and collapse in so many fields, and you are witnessing that. I don't want to get into the philosophical details, which are the topic of the specialists and the scholars in research, and as we did in the morning, and we will still do that tomorrow, but here I'm speaking about the general context which is beneficial to all of you. I would say, therefore, that in the economic sphere we find that the phenomenon of interest or usury and monopoly and exploitation has become prevalent, and that carries with it details. Socially, we find disintegration in the family and social disintegration in the fabric of society. Also politically, corruption and hypocrisy and deception also has become prevalent. Each one needs details, but I will suffice to speak about what you witness in reality. The intellectual side, there is now attempts to hijack that model and to promote corruption. And there is also corruption in the ethical sphere, in addition to the spread of media misinformation and unethical showing of things that are against society's decorum. So we find schools handing the graduates certificates that are void of their ethical dimension. It is not enough to be knowledgeable and know the rules of your religion and what you should do toward your Lord and nation and what will save you in the worldly life and the hereafter only, but rather this knowledge should be translated into work, and this knowledge should become a behavior. Unless a Muslim practices what he knows, then this will be a detriment to himself, and you know that very well. Another question is, did Islam support? Of course, you know that Islam takes care of ethics, but in the Islamic world we find that Islam takes care of ethics. We find, for example, that the Prophet, peace be upon him, when he speaks about bir or goodness as one word, which is having a good ethical behavior or moral, and he says also the righteousness is in good manners or good ethics. And the Prophet, peace be upon him, would pray, saying to Allah, "Oh Allah, guide me to the best of ethics. Nobody guides to its best except you, O Allah. And make me avoid the worst of ethics. No one helps me to do that except you." And Allah has granted the Prophet, peace be upon him, a blessing by saying to him, "You are indeed of a great religion or ethics or morals." I don't want to get into the details of our heritage or legacy, but you know well that Islam has paid a great attention to this issue, and maybe the Arab poet Ahmad Shawqi, the prince of poets, who said nations are nothing but their morals. If their morals go away, then they go away. So I say that your nobility is not measured by your praying and fasting, but rather your ethics and your chivalry. And we have seen this in many texts exemplified when the Prophet, peace be upon him, who was never ever bad-mouthing, and he said the best of you is the best of manners, and other texts that tackle this issue, and I have so many of them. However, in a nutshell, I would say that we have in the Islamic legacy such texts in the Quran or the traditions of the Prophet or the behavior of our predecessors. So the problem is that we have a disease, which is we are not facing the problem, and we don't try to find a solution for it, and we don't have in most times the true will to change the status quo and repair ethics and reform them. And also among the main reasons of the ethical crisis that we live nowadays, this is predicated on three components: the creedal pollution and the intellectual pollution and the value pollution. And we could explain that also in sub-details or themes. There is lack of religiosity in the hearts of the Muslims, the wrong vision of the Islamic rules and laws and ethics, also the absence of a role model in many fields, and also the materialistic life becoming trumping in our behavior, and lack of awareness programs and activities which pay attention to ethics. Also lack of religious and ethical rearing in so many fields and walks of life. Also, no enactment of laws and legislations that respect the general ethical values and morals. So if we want to redirect our compass, then we have to pay attention to ethics in our life in order to uplift ourselves again and to be in the place and stature that is worthy of our nation, which our nation was a role model and has exported that model to the rest of nations. And the philosopher Will Durant, well known in his book, The Story of Civilization, he said 4 components for civilization. There are 4 components for civilization. After he has defined that, he said social system that helps man to increase his productivity. In culture, he said these are 4 pillars: economic resources, political systems or regimes, traditions of ethics, and following up with ethics and sciences. So if we want to have a stature that is clear in civilization, then we have to uphold ethics and traditions and morals. Is it possible to assess our ethics and to build it and instill it in ourselves? I said there are several factors that would make it possible. And as the ethics scholars or Islamic intellectuals have said, that ethics are gained or acquired, and this is prevalent. And as they say, patience is by exercising patience. And the main element in assessing ethics is science and knowledge. Because man, when he knows well what are the good ethics, he will follow them. And when he knows well what are the bad ethics, he will avoid them. Second, to connect between his education of ethics and his faith in Allah Almighty. After that comes the fact that he should remember what he learned of ethics vis-a-vis life and implementing that practically in daily life. Also, it is important to strengthen the meanings of the creed or faith in the self. And the most important element is faith in Allah, God, and the day of resurrection and the message of the Prophet, peace be upon him. And if we really want to believe in the message of the Prophet, peace be upon him, then we have to emulate him in his behavior and his ethics. And as they say, if you love someone, you emulate that person and you obey him. Also, after that, we have to start doing good deeds which helps a person to strengthen his ethics and assess them, and to help him accept good ethics and to rid him of the bad ethics, because science alone and knowledge alone is not sufficient. It has to be followed by works. Allah said, those who purify themselves are the successful ones. And here comes the role of the rituals or the worships. So the goal of all Islamic worship is in essence an ethical one. And you know well that the main goal of the prophethood of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, is an ethical one. He said, I was sent but to perfect the ethics. And you know that prayer forbids you from lewdness and evil, and you find that almsgiving is a purification of oneself. Allah says to the Prophet, take from them a charity that would purify them. And also, charity makes you stay away from hypocrisy, and Hajj or pilgrimage teaches you patience and overcoming your desires and lusts and spending your money in something that is noble. And this is the way of the acts of worship. And before the last item, staying away from bad ethics that you want to get rid of. I know well that some ethics are bad, so I have to avoid them and to go against that tide. And as it has come in the Prophet saying that a man complained to the Prophet, peace be upon him, of his heart's hardship. So the Prophet, peace be upon him, told him, wipe the hair of an orphan and feed the needy, in order that you make your heart lenient. So this should be style of the Muslims' daily behavior. And as I told you, the issue also of mannerism. Sometimes we are exercising mannerism and we make it a fashion. So you should learn more in order to become more educated, and you should exercise more patience to become patient. Also to mingle with the believers who are of good faith and good ethics and manners, and listening to them and learning from them. Also another point is to take up a role model for yourself, and the best example that you have is our beloved Prophet, peace be upon him. Allah said, in the messenger of Allah you had a great role model for anyone who seeks the reward of this life and in the hereafter, and who remembers Allah. So if you missed seeing the Prophet, peace be upon him, with your own vision, then at least you should follow his teachings and emulate his ethics and manners, peace be upon him. Also staying away from corrupt environment, in order that you deeply root manners and ethics in yourself, in addition to what I have mentioned, that you should stay away from any unethical environment where there's corrupt values and corrupt ethics. I will conclude even before the time you allotted to me. So in a nutshell, what I would like to say is that, in fact, we are living a true crisis, and that we are staying away from the teachings of our religion that call for good ethics and to avoid bad, evil ethics. And maybe we follow some behaviors, whether they are in the West or elsewhere. Of course, there are ethics. And I told you, and I mentioned that Muhammad Abdu has spoken about that, and there are ethics in the West, and they link that to the value structure or the law in general. And those ethics in Islam are compulsory. Also, you should be committed to them. So if you are committed, and there is a compulsory text, whether it's from the Quran or the traditions of the Prophet or other Islamic legacy teachings, then you should be respectful of it, and you should be committed to it, and you should be responsible. And the main rule built on by Imam Malik, Allah bless him, who died in 179 Hijri, many issues based on the issue of don't harm yourself and do not harm others. So I conclude with the saying of Makhlad ibn al-Husayn, who died in 191 Hijri, in which he says, we need ethics more than we need talking. And ethics is part of morals. Ibn al-Qayyim, the student of Ibn Taymiyyah, said religion is ethics. So if you have religion, then you should have ethics. So anyone who exceeds you in ethics, then he indeed exceeds you in religion. Thank you all. May Allah bless you and give you His peace.
شكرا.
Thank you very much, Dr. Jamal Nassar, and in a nutshell, I will try to summarize what he has said. He confirmed the adherence of ethics and morals and the challenges associated with it, and he talked about the spreading of bad manners in different aspects of life, like economy, education. Also, he talked about the richness of Islam and the teachings of Islam related to ethics and moralities, and he's tried to identify the problem. Talked about creed or faith corruption and intellectual corruption, as well as the value corruptions, and he talked about the correctiveness, and he talked about some of the prospects and alluded to the adherence of ethics and the acquisition of ethics and moralities and apply these in real life.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your patience. We will open the floor for discussion. So I was advised actually that anyone who is interested to ask a question to come forward to this stage here. So please feel free to ask questions and also to move and come forward and ask your questions. We will have a first round of a few questions. Then we'll allow our distinguished guest speakers to respond, and then we will take another round if it's necessary. So who would like to start? Yes, please, come forward. So please identify yourself and, of course, be brief, please, and direct your question to whom you like. Thank you.
My question is to Dr. Koons. He has identified many areas where we have progressed as humanity. But I would say that there are areas where we have gone down significantly. The nuclear question, where our whole existence is threatened as never before. Environmental degradation, where we may end up finishing ourselves. Deterioration of family. In fact, where the progress is the most, the family is the most under threat. So when the balance is done, I think it's an open question whether we have progressed or regressed. But my real question is progress the right metric to measure issues related to ethics? And then I would request Dr. Ramadan also to give his view on this question. Thank you.
Well, I think both of those. I'm not sure whether you intended me to respond to both, but I think they're both worth responding to. I think progress. I think progress of this sort is worth considering when we're talking about ethics, because when we think about some of the most fundamental ethical acts that we do, the goal is to improve the welfare of those around us. So you think about giving to charity to relieve the plight of someone who is homeless or someone who is a refugee, to put a roof over someone's head, to put food on their table. These are fundamental ethical acts, and the goal of them is to improve the welfare and the well-being of people in the world. And so if we can look at the world and say, there are, only a fifth as many people are living in poverty, absolute poverty now, as 200 years ago, I would say that is an improvement in the ethical state of the world, actually, not just in the economic state of the world. So I would talk about that in terms of progress. Now, as to your question about whether on balance there's been progress, I think that's actually possibly an open question. I agree that in terms of environmental degradation, that's a very serious question. Right now, there was actually one of my colleagues was telling me about a very interesting talk over at Qatar University. Environmentally, things are quite bad. Apparently, we're in the midst of a mass extinction, which is not widely talked about. We all know the perils of global warming and other kinds of environmental catastrophes. I think you would have to ask one of our colleagues in security studies over at Georgetown whether I think some of the more hard-headed realists would actually argue that nuclear weapons have made us more secure because it prevents the kind of world war that we saw twice in the 20th century. Major powers just don't go to war anymore. I'm not sure I agree with that. I think they fight proxy wars instead of fighting direct wars. So I think that in a sense that hasn't really affected the level of conflict in the world too much. But I think you're right. I think I think we shouldn't be too rosy-eyed about the amount of progress because there are also significant challenges alongside that. But again, I think a lot of these challenges have the same kinds of familiar causes. People putting short-term gain ahead of long-term cost and things like that. So yeah, I think it's an open question. But it's challenges and prospects. So I get a pass, right?
Yes, please. Another option, instead of coming down here, those who can come down to the stage to ask questions, that's fine. Otherwise, you can still write also and submit a paper and direct it to one of the speakers. Yes, sister, please come forward.
My name is Mariam Tahir. I'm a student of Islamic Thought and Applied Ethics. My question is, can we really be ethical and find answers to our questions in an unethical environment? I mean, here in this part of the world, not here, be it Muslims or atheists or Christians, we're living under very oppressive environments, which is causing us to oppress each other, patronize each other. So I don't know, how can we detach ourselves from the current realities, but at the same time stay connected? Basically, how to apply the knowledge and make an impact.
Dr. Tariq, please, your response to the first question. And this question actually is for all of you, if you would like to respond. Please.
I think there is the answer is in your question, or at least in the way you put the question, that no, progress per se is not the right metric when it comes to the ethical. And I think I agree with what you said right now. Now, there is a difference between thinking, acknowledging the fact that progress, it's a human reality. It's part of our destiny. It's part of our accumulation of knowledge and accumulation of technology. What is essential in the way we look, and this is why it's important, complexification of the world and cumulative knowledge means, from a spiritual viewpoint, that everything you do, you have to ask the ethical question, meaning and the ethical question is not, is it good and bad? The first is the opposite. So this is why I'm saying again, the ethical question is mainly about what is your intention and what are the goals? Why are you trying to do what you are doing? What is the very meaning of the progress that we are achieving now when it comes to technology? So this preventive or preemptive question, ethical question, is questioning the very essence of the movement itself. Not that, we are gaining knowledge and that's it. And then we come afterward and we ask the question, is it right or wrong? If we do this, which is now the state of affairs in our Islamic tradition, fiqh, by definition, is always coming afterward. It's This is why, for example, the Orientalists and many of the Muslims are translating fiqh as jurisprudence, while, by the way, it's not only jurisprudence, it's law and jurisprudence, which is jurisprudence is to try to catch up. So the progress is there, we catch up. The ethical question is not at all the same. The ethical question should be a vision before catching up. It's the vision about what we are doing. So the ethical question comes before. Is questioning the very essence of our behavior and our technology and our means to achieve what. And this is what you, in fact, implicitly, this is the question that we have now. By saying this, when it comes to progress, we are not against the progress. We are against its direction and what we are trying to achieve and who is doing it and for the sake of what. What are you trying to do? Very often I have a problem with the way Muslims are, just to show that we are, following in the footsteps of, promoting progress, and progress is good. We are sometimes unable to challenge the very essence of the progress that we are talking about. So to make progress or to halalize progress in itself doesn't make you modern. It makes you lost in the way you are dealing with this. And the last thing that I wanted to say, which is a connection between your question and the second question that we have now, wherever you, I don't know where you are, yeah, wherever you are in the West, in this country, you are surrounded by corruption. Get me? Wherever you are. Political, financial, human corruption. Even in your place, even at home. So there are things that are corrupt, there are power relationship. By definition, the fact that this is where you are because the world has been created like this, saying, وَالْعَصْرِ إِنَّ الْإِنسَانَ لَفِي خُسْرٍ, that you are going to see this wherever you are. The only way you are close to Him, out of your love towards Him, is to do your best wherever you are to change the world for the better. It means that you should never give up. It's not a question of quantity, it's a question of principle. So, the fact that, for example, you look at the world, environment, we are going to destroy the world. We are destroying it now in front of us. Okay? Whatever you can do to make it better, that's your moral, ethical responsibility. So it's not utilitarianist, it's not quantitative, it's by principle. Our ecology, it's not an ecology coming out of the catastrophes that we are facing, it's an ecology out of principles that we have to respect. The way we deal with human beings, the way we have, for example, to deal with it, it's a question of principles. But let me be clear on this. Not only it's not a question of quantity, but it's not a question of simplicity, of being simplistic. And I give you an example. Islam is against racism. You look at what is happening in the world today. You look at what is happening in this country. You look at what is happening in the United States of America, for example, or here. When the way we deal with migrants, for example, or the way we deal with black people in the United States of America. Why is it that the African American are putting the right question to us today? They say, if you are an American citizen, you have to be against racism. It doesn't mean that you go to the people and say, you know what, we are going to support you because you are black and discriminated. You have to get a deep sense of the environment. What is corrupt in the environment? Only the fact that we don't like the black people or the Latinos, for example, or that we have a problem within our Muslim communities in the way we deal with sometimes the Pakistani or the Hindi or whatever, or the black people even. Is it this the problem? No. The problem is the rational, the deep structure that is, or structures that are producing racism in a power relationship, in a system which is corrupt in itself. So you have a responsibility.
It's not to deal with corruption which is visible, is the structure of corruption that is dealing with the whole system. So we have to stop in the name of being good to be simplistic. I say, I'm good, I'm giving zakat. Zakat is not about helping the poor. Zakat is about challenging a system not to produce poverty. That's deeper than that. The way we deal with the world, we are very simplistic. Very simplistic. So when you are dealing with a corrupt system, please try to get the very understanding of the system. This is what I was saying about democracy. This is what I'm saying about the environment. The Muslims on environment are so simplistic that they are nowhere in the discussion. Nowhere. We are not in the discussion. We come with, you know what, in Islam, everything was said about the way we have to deal with the environment. Look at what we are doing. Look at what we are doing. So my point here is, the question is not, do we have to deal with corruption in a corrupt environment? Not only this, you have to study the structure of corruption and what is wrong in the system. So it means to be very deep with the environment.
To Dr. Tariq, we have received a question in Arabic, so I will pose it to the panel here.
نطرحه على المتحدثين. What is the general context of ethics that we should use to rear our children of all religions in order that they would be able to lead a life built on humanity and effective ethics and morals in the future? Whoever would like to tackle this one, you have the floor. Dr. Nassar, go ahead. To make it easy for our sister, and the issue is no longer difficult because here we have really spoken in a beautiful way, so we should simplify the issue as much as possible, as difficult as it is. When I spoke about how do we formulate and gain and acquire ethics, I mentioned 11 factors. I will summarize them in 3 now for simplicity, especially that you have tackled an important issue, which is the environment in which a person lives and the society, which compels a person to bad ethics and pushes him to that. What do? I say that we should uphold ethics as if they are religion. I told you the saying of Ibn al-Qayyim al-Jawziyah that religion is ethics. So this is something that we should be committed to. Second, friendship or companionship or good company, which are the people of ethics. Third, you should do your best to disseminate good ethics by personifying them yourself, within yourself, embodying them, and to do as much as possible to disseminate them between people. That's a point. Another point, I listened to Dr. Koons. I heard a statement, I don't know if I understood it correctly, I got it through translation. He said that things are different and there is progress now at the ethical level in the world. True? Yes. I differ with him completely. Why? Because the reality that we see now suggests the opposite of that completely. Maybe in the past there were some ethics in Western societies or in the societies in which we live. We even had something called norms and traditions at some point in time. Even those things are taken into account in the Islamic jurisprudence or Sharia. So the West, however, deals with us in terms of even humanitarian ethics in a way that is really bewildering. For example, what Dr. Ramadan said about democracy, for example. They want a democracy that's relevant to them. But if we want to apply democracy, then it is as if it is something alien and it shouldn't exist, and we should not live a normal life. I give an example. For example, in Egypt, During the days of the Foreign Ministry or State Department Secretary Condoleezza Rice, in 2005, give or take, they were pushing the regime of Hosni Mubarak. They say politics is the livelihood, or everything is intertwined within politics. So I conclude with this story. They have pressured Hosni Mubarak to carry out reforms, and they said not only in Egypt but in the region there should be reforms. So they found out that when the Islamists have gotten the elections, they got 80 seats. Hamas in Gaza, they got 67 or 76 seats. So they said, no, let's go back and seek stability. So general human ethics are absent by all. So we should take an initiative as Muslims, and I said to you that we should embody those ethics and make them a religion in our behavior, and to watch ourselves. Sufi scholars, in terms of holding yourself accountable, they make this a habit in their life. And I say the good company is something to be sought, especially that at all times you should do that. And I don't agree that there are no ethics in the West, and we should embody those ethics, as I said, and disseminate.
لو دكتور طارق يتفضل بخصوص سؤال أو even Koons also this question please. So the question is about how to educate our children. Yes, how to educate our children from a different background, the religious background, to be ethical and to live an ethical life. Dr. Koons, please.
I think this may be where some fundamental disagreement rears its ugly head. Don't worry, if anyone's looking for someone to defend U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East, you're looking in the wrong place. But look, for me, there's a fundamental connection between ethics and people's well-being, and I think this comes back to the first question, where the questioner talked about how much worse the family is. And for me, this is something that doesn't compute. Here's a story I often tell. Johann Sebastian Bach, the famous German composer, lived in a time of peace in his land. He had 12 children. He outlived 6 of them and his first wife. How is this a flourishing family, I ask you, right? How is this a good family situation? He was a God-fearing man who loved his family, who had no desire to divorce or do anything bad, and yet he watched 7 of his intimate relatives die before he did. When I talk about the ethical improvement of the world, I talk about a world in which people living in a peaceful country, not in a time of war, don't watch this happen on a regular basis. I'm talking about a world in which people don't die of childhood disease. People don't watch half of their children die of dysentery or smallpox or polio or whatever. This is what I'm talking about by an ethical world. If gays marry and have children, well, that's great. I'm for it, right? There's the fundamental disagreement. I don't regard that as the disintegration of the family. I regard the disintegration of the family when you bury half of your children and your wife. That's the disintegration of the family. And when I talk about a more ethical world, I talk about a world where things like this don't happen as often as they used to. God knows they still happen. And that's the moral tragedy of today, that it happens at all. We're never going to have a world where it doesn't happen. But we're going to but the goal is to have a world where it happens less often. And the causes of less moral suffering in the world are not merely things like ethics. They're the progress of science. They're the progress of greater distribution of wealth. They're the progress of things like this. And I think I'm going to use this as my opportunity to circle back to Dr. Ramadan's point, where he talked about the science of ethics. This is where I want to put in a pitch for the science of ethics and talk about another space of ethical improvement. I've served on the IRB at a couple of different universities, the Institutional Review Board. The job of the Institutional Review Board is to look at research and make sure it's done in an ethical way. Now, if anyone knows anything about the history of medical research, Dr. Ghali, I'm sure knows quite a lot about it, it used to be a total horror show. If you look at something like the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, a bunch of scientists in America thought it would be extremely educational to look at a group of African American men who had syphilis and not tell them they had syphilis, just to watch it progress through a secondary, tertiary syphilis until these men died insane, while also passing on syphilis to their wives because they thought, hey, let's see what happens when syphilis goes untreated in people. Right? Well, because of cases like this, laws and principles regarding how human subject research is to be conducted were formulated, and this is the science of ethics in action. Rules regarding rules regarding beneficence, rules regarding patient's autonomy, rules regarding protection of patient privacy, rules regarding not harming people, rules regarding what counts as a vulnerable population, prisoners, children, elderly, people with mental disabilities. And these laws, these ethical principles were written into federal law, and this federal law guides the actions of every institutional review board in the US and many IRBs that are not in the US. And I agree, there's some sense of inevitability about all of this. You know, if you read the ethical literature on, for example, genetic engineering, there's an air of gloomy inevitability that, you know, well, there's all these ethical concerns, but let's be realistic. You know, when this becomes realistic technology, all these ethical qualms are going to be swept aside by all the wealthy parents who want to, you know, make their kids smart and athletic and handsome. So what's the answer? Is the answer just to do nothing, or is the answer to try to create a regulatory and ethical framework to deal with something that's inevitably going to happen? So what does this mean about ethics and what to teach your children? I think I would like to teach my child that ethics is about treating people well, about improving their well-being, about not making them worse off. And ultimately, when I talk about the ethical improvement of the world, that's what I'm talking about. Are people being made better off, or are they being made worse off? Are people still dying of poverty, war, and disease? Are they dying at the same rate that they used to be dying? That's what I care about. That's what matters to me.
So, thank you. So what I'm going to do, because of the time constraint, so I will read all questions and allow our speakers to respond briefly. If also there is any burning question, we still can. Waiting. Yes, you will be fine. No problem. Just wait 1 second. I will read these questions and then you can still ask. Sure, no problem. So, ما هو الإطار العام?
What is the framework of ethics that we need to rear our children so as to be able to achieve a good life based on humanity and effective ethics? We have heard from Dr. Koons. Now I will hear from Dr. Tariq.
What is the difference between akhlaq and maqasid, or the relationship between akhlaq and maqasid? Can human beings, another question for all presenters and speakers, can a human being reach ethical satisfaction or goals without being guided by a divine source? If yes, how do you justify? If not necessary, also how do you justify? Another question, how to face the deficiency in language to differentiate between value and ethics? Okay, I will allow our guest from this side to pose the questions here. Please come forward.
Bismillah, assalamu alaikum. My name is Abdurrahman Didash. I'm a student in this faculty, student of public policy. My question is to Dr. Ramadan. I think my question is similar to one of the questions that have been written. in applying ethics in the way that you describe them, you know, in the way that we have to look at the goals of whatever we are going to do, which puts us in evaluating future consequences of our choices or our decisions. Basically, ethics, the way I understand it, is putting self-interest or public interest instead ahead of self-interest. Do you think that can be applied without divine guidance, as the question said? And if yes, what is the motive or what is the drive that that can help people to apply that? Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum, Sufyan Abbar from QCRI. My question goes to the conclusion of Dr. Tariq Ramadan, where you presented actually two different and profoundly different views of ethics, and you said that for Muslims, God's law is at the center of ethics, while for like Westerner and more precisely maybe secularist, the individual is in the center of the ethical system. Now, does this mean that we have different ethical systems in the world and different people with different backgrounds can have different systems? Or is the difference just in the motivation itself, but in practice it's actually the same? And now if we acknowledge that different people may have different ethical backgrounds, how can we make sure to provide these people a space where they can live, that they can live in and share without conflicts? Thank you.
With these questions, of course, I know that there are overwhelming questions, and I'm sure also that there are many people would like also to ask more questions, but I really apologize because the time constraints, so I will allow our speakers to comment in 2 minutes each about these questions, and then we will close the session because we have refreshment also, and we have the questionnaire, and that should be also submitted to the registration area. So would you like Dr. Tariq to start first?
Okay, just quickly, and then I think that about what was said about what should we teach our children, and once again, I think that there are many things on which we agree. But I would say from an Islamic perspective, from within and reaching out to other philosophies, and there are mainly, I would say, 3 things that are important in education. And once again, we also had this discussion about something which is an essential concept when it comes to ethics, is responsibility. Step by step, in the way we are educating our children, a sense of responsibility, which is a taklif, that you are responsible of yourself, you are responsible of the people around you, you are responsible of the al-mas'uliyya, al-taklif. This is essential, is a sense which from the beginning, it's not you as an individual is the center, but you have a responsibility, even towards your own self, which once again is, you know, it's deep. It's just to say, you know what, it starts with your own body. This body is not your property. You don't have even the ownership. You have to deal with it, but this is a trust. That's an essential dimension which is different from, but once again, we can find common ground, I agree. There is a second thing that you said, and it's very often underestimated from an Islamic perspective, which is well-being. You have the right to feel good. It's ethical. And very often the religious discourse is not about feeling good. While if we understand the ethical reference in the Quran, al-ma'ruf, known by the people as being good, is based on the well-being. So there is an ethical dimension in feeling good, feeling at peace.
So to confuse the ethical with the judgmental is not to get the point. It's not this. Al-Ma'ruf, known by the people as being good because God, Ar-Rahman, said it with and through his mercy. This is the second thing. And the third dimension that I would say we have to teach our kids as first, al-mas'uliyah, responsibility, well-being. You have the right to feel good, and you have the right to, and you have the responsibility and the right to serve the people. Serving, it's important. Serving, it's important. So this is, for me, the three dimensions of any ethical education. Responsible, feel good, and serve. Be responsible, feel good, and serve. And you have the right to do that. The difference between al-akhlaq, ethics, values, and maqasid are the higher objective. I would say that all the higher objectives are ethical per se. So I would say these are two different things, but if we look at the higher objective, they are ethical per se, and we have to deal with them in such a way. From an Islamic perspective, of course, the source is the divine. Now, can we say that anything which is ethical is only coming from God? Sorry, from an Islamic perspective, yes, with one point which has to be clarified, that everything is coming from God, even my mind. And my mind can produce ethical values and can get them. So if I see somebody who say there is no God, but he or she thinks with his or her mind, for me there is not a contradiction. There is something out of the mind which is close to what I think is coming from God. You get my point? Rationality, it's not challenging my understanding of the world. So any rational production of ethical values is not in contradiction for me with something that I can get from the divine source, to the exception that some of the values that are produced only by rationality should be checked for me from something which is the divine order. This is where we disagree. I say, but it's not per se a contradiction. What is going to be challenged are the limits. Where are you? What are the limits? Can you justify everything rationally from a religious perspective? No. But could you or can you justify things rationally? Yes. The question is up to where? What are, and this is coming from the revelation and the central role of the revelation. Last thing that I wanted to say here about, no, I didn't say that everything is coming from God's law. Get me right. What I was saying, which is from a metaphysical perspective, a worldview as well, it's the center is God as being the center of your reference, which is the meaning of Tawheed in the Islamic tradition. And by the way, Tawheed is what is going to reconcile the fuqaha, the maqasidiyin and the Sufi. It's the centrality of God here. It's not about the law. Once again, let me be clear, I never translate Sharia as God's law. Sharia for me, it's God's way. Laws are means to the way, not the way. They are just helping us to get the limits of what are the rules. So I would say here that yes, there are different ethical systems, of course, of course. And this is where I think that what is interesting in the first production of roles, for example, in the second, is what he was mentioning by the overlapping consensus. It's very interesting, and I think on this there are many things that we can agree upon, that there are things that are overlapping, that we agree on some of the things, but his intuition that something could be missing in the first theory, it's exactly why I say that's it, that we don't agree here, that there are things that the way you construct the whole thing based on al-adl, for example, justice as being central is something that we disagree on the source. And you acknowledge that there are different sources, but there are still consensus or agreement that we can have between the different systems. But I would say the starting point of our universal claim is to acknowledge that there are different ways. That's essential for me, to avoid arrogance, to avoid power position, or speaking about the universal as if the universal is ours. And to tell you the truth, it's something that you can find in the West, but something that we can find among Muslims. When they speak about universality, it's their universality, and not understanding that there are different ways for the people to get this and to try to produce an ethical system. Our humility, intellectual, spiritual humility, is to acknowledge the fact that there are different ways, and there are common values on which we can agree.
Thank you, Dr. Koons, please.
While Dr. Ramadan was speaking, I was reminded of one of my favorite quotes from St. Paul, though I'm not a Christian. He writes that the Gentiles have the law written on their hearts. And what he's trying to convey is that even someone who doesn't share, who doesn't have religious faith, God has nevertheless written the moral law on their hearts, and they still know right from wrong, though they don't have access to Scripture. And you know, I think that the best use of my time here is to respond to some of the questions. There were a couple of questions about how do you justify ethics without a divine source, and what's the motivation for being ethical if you're not worried if there's no divine, or you don't believe in God. This idea that there aren't any values in the world if there's no God is, I think, a puzzling one from the secular point of view. I remember reading some commentary once that said that that the world only has values in it if God gave it to us, treats the world as though it's a really terrible gift that's only valuable because of the giver. And I think there's a degree of insight in that. If you think the world doesn't have any value, but it's only valuable because God gave it to us, then what is your attitude toward the world? That it doesn't have value in it, that some things aren't good and some things aren't bad in the world. And the secular viewpoint starts from that viewpoint. It starts from the viewpoint that the world does have valuable things in it. There are some things in the world that are valuable. There are some things in the world that are good and some things that are bad, independently of where the world came from. And once you start with that premise, then morality is, well, not easy to construct, but it's not impossible. If pain is bad and joy is good, then, you know, if death is bad and love is good, then you have your foundation for morality right there. Because that's the world we want to create, right there. And I agree, it would certainly be foolish to say that humans never act in their own self-interest. Of course, humans are selfish. But it's also wrong to say that humans are only selfish. I think the classic criticism of this view is Bishop Butler's. Hundreds of years ago, gave a very thorough demolition of the idea that humans only ever act in their own self-interest, the view called psychological egoism. Bishop Butler's is the classic refutation of psychological egoism, and it's been imitated, but it's never been improved on. You know, even I was having this discussion earlier today. David Hume, in his very poetic style, said humans have a bit of the dove kneaded in with the wolf and the serpent. This idea that we are capable of putting the interest of others ahead of self-interest. Not that we always do it, but we are capable of it. And as long as you are capable of putting the interest of others ahead of yourself, even occasionally, then it's possible to act from the moral point of view. That's not to say that people always will. I mean, I think that was one of the main points of my talk, is that self-interest and people's selfishness is one of the constant threats to ethics and to morality and to acting from the moral point of view. but people can help act from the moral point of view. They often need encouragement, they sometimes need threats, but they can act from the moral point of view. So that's how I would respond to these questions that were raised earlier.
I think we need to respond to the question why we were created by God. If we answer this question, we will be very comfortable with the question. And I think the direct answer is to worship God. When we look at worship, look at worship in a very narrow meaning, the rituals, or much more expanded. Ritual or ibadah simplifies or defines what God likes. When a person asks himself why he was created, if he knows the purpose of the creation, I think his compass will point to the right direction. The other issue is that everybody has a role in life. Every person, every human being has a role at the individual level. If we look at it as a pyramid, the base of the pyramid is the individual. The more he acquires or possesses morals or manners and ethics, this foundation will be very strong. If he void himself of these manners, nothing will help him, the family or the state or the universe. So the individual is an integral component of this equation, and this individual need to live with the concept not harming others, neither harm himself, and should not be selfish. Yes, this is a two-way street, and the family has a very important role in instilling ethics and morals. Even the educational system, any shortcomings in these pillars will indeed affect the ethical system and will eventually require double the effort to rectify any errors. The state also has a huge role in spreading and disseminating ethics. Some may think that I am idealistic in my presentation. However, the state sometimes pushes us to relinquish some of the ethics. Even the whole universe has a role, and each has its role in building this ethical system. If every individual, family, society, state, and international system knew the importance of ethics and moral in life, life would be much better than what we are living through nowadays. Thank you very much, Dr. Nassar.
Gentlemen, I know that we are running out of time, and just before closing, I would like to kindly remind you to submit the form, the evaluation form, that's the istimara, and put it on the desk or registration desk outside. And I also would like to invite you all to join us outside from this side. There are some refreshments, so you're welcome. And with this, I would like to thank our distinguished speakers, Dr. Tariq Ramadan, Dr. Jeremy Kunz, Dr. Jamal Nassar, and I would like to thank you all for being and resisting to the last minute. May Allah bless you, and thank you very much for being here tonight. Thank you.